Midland Railroad, because, oh, I also need to know how many people here have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches today? I thought maybe Ann did. Anybody else?
I had peanut butter.
Okay, that counts. National Peanut Butter and Jelly Day today. I just wanted you to be sure and know that. So if you didn't have it for lunch, you better have it for dinner tonight. Okay, so talking about the Midland Railroad, which, as you know, is another great chapter in our railroad history. I've kind of used a compilation of 3 authors to do this stuff. The WPA Writers Project has wonderful information about the early railroads in Jackson County. And then we'll be talking about the others as we go along. But they always have such an interesting way of putting things, so I wanted to read to you in their words kind of what they said. In 1870, 3 railroads stretched their new shining tracks across Jackson County Prairie in the southern part, and a 4th was projected to run along the Mississippi from the north to the south. Farmers looked forward to a day soon to come when their exhausting, dangerous trips to the mill and market would cease, when produce could be taken to the nearest railroad station and flour could be bought at the village store, obviating a trip to the mill which sometimes took weeks to complete. That's how they started their chapter. But we all know that Jackson County has great railroad history, kind of in all directions, and we were very fortunate in our early days to be serviced by so many unique and different lines. And we kind of determined that of the 13 larger towns in Jackson County, only 5 never had a railroad, we think. They were Andrew, St. Donatus, Springbrook, Fulton, and Canton. And though here and there were plans to make a railroad go that way, those 5 never got a railroad. But the 2 lines that we have in Jackson County that are really unique, kind of to our history at least, of course, our Bellevue Cascade narrow gauge, and we have the last remaining depot out here. We talk about that a lot. But one that we don't talk about quite so much, and we should, is the Midland. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. It was immediately following the Civil War. There was a 3-way race to build a railroad to Maquoketa. The first one was the Sebula, Ackley, and Dakota. And that was actually the first actual functioning railroad in Jackson County. And the first locomotive was a work engine, and it was ferried across the Mississippi at Sebula. And that railroad was active for some time. And they built toward Maquoketa, and as they came our way, the towns of Miles and Preston sprung up. They abandoned their plans to come clear to Maquoketa, however, when they saw the progress that the other 2 railroads were making. The second railroad was the Iowa Midland. It was organized by Colonel William Shaw, and he proposed to run it from Clinton to Maquoketa. And the Midland then took over part of the roadbed that the Sebula, Atkins, and St. Paul had started, and they used their roadbed. But the third railroad that was involved was the Davenport and St. Paul Railroad. And these names might not be real familiar to you because mergers and acquisitions took place even back then, and so one company bought another company. But back then it was the Davenport and St. Paul Railroad, and they were also racing to be the first to reach Maquoketa. And of course the goal was to see who could get tracks laid and get the first train into Maquoketa. And it was a very involved and a very intriguing story. It involved old friends of ours like Jay Goodnow and Platt Smith. Very, very interesting stories, but that's a tale for another day. It's very, very involved. But back to the Iowa Writers Project, the WPA. The Davenport and St. Paul Railroad completed its track to Maquoketa early in December 1870. Almost at the same time that this happened, the Midland Railroad reached Delmer. So those things happened at the same time. Then, as a courtesy, the Midland was allowed to use the tracks of the Davenport and St. Paul from Delmer into Maquoketa, so that on the 13th of December, 1870, trains from both railroads could arrive in town almost at the same time. The townspeople, as you can imagine, were jubilant. And again, as described in some of the articles in the Jackson Sentinel and the WPA, kind of combine their stories. It must have looked something like this, okay? As noon approached, the black smoke from the Wyoming engine smokestack was sighted, and the train appeared far down the shining steel rails, with an engineer clutching at the whistle cord. There were 6 coaches filled with dignitaries of all kinds, a baggage car and a platform car. And thousands of people gathered here to witness the arrival of the first train from Davenport. When they saw the smoke and they heard the whistle, they broke into a prolonged and lusty cheering and whistling. And the booming of the little 4-pounder could be heard. The little 4-pounder was the only piece of artillery that the city of Maquoketa had back then, a little cannon. And moments later, with a triumphant blast, the train rolled to a stop, and an immense, hungry crowd poured out of it into the streets. Oh, come on. Don't do this to me. There are just days that things don't go well. And when it comes to computers, it's every day for me. Okay. So, the first train into Midland, this is the first train that the Midland ran into Maquoketa on that day. And I'm sorry, the picture's poor newspaper clipping. A few seconds after the first train came, the other train's wheels screeched to a stop. The wood-burning Chicago and Northwestern locomotive, called the J.B. Turner, made the first run on the Midland branch, pulling 3 of the Northwestern Company's finest coaches, drawn by this powerful engine. The Clintonians and the Lyonese joined in the procession up the street to feast on roast turkey and chicken, topped off with pastry, and washed down with the best extracts of gunpowder and Java. Now that must have meant something back then. That we're not quite sure what that was. But that was in the newspaper in the WPA. Okay, the people that came along were called excursionists, and the excursionists, who were accompanied by a brass band, they were transferred, once they got here, they were transferred to vehicles, so they must have been horse-drawn vehicles, of course, and they were taken to various public halls and private residences around town. Schrader's New Hall, downtown Maquoketa, they were all set up on the 2nd floor, and in the storeroom beneath had been fitted with tables, and they could seat 400 people at one time. And these tables, they say, fairly groaned, and we hear that often in the old writings. The tables fairly groaned under the weight of everything imaginable in the edible line provided by the good people of this city and vicinity. Never was the proverbial hospitality of our town better illustrated. It went on to say, at the close of this banquet, which served over 1,500 people, a short program of congratulatory addresses took place on a temporary platform on Main Street. President Hiram Price of the Davenport and St. Paul Road delivered an address in which he spoke of fulfilling a promise that was made to the citizens of Maquoketa a year before, that was a railroad coming to their town. Congratulating the people of Maquoketa on their liberality and enterprise, he pictured the happiness of the outside world in being connected with so prosperous and promising a town as Maquoketa, and so rich a country as the Garden of Jackson County. So they partied all day, and at 3 p.m. the excursionists were escorted to their cars, again, horse-drawn, and were soon speeding on their way home. Well, those cars could have been train cars, right? Probably train cars. Okay. Probably, the newspaper reports that probably the happiest man in the crowd of thousands was John Goodnow, J.E. Goodnow, first settler and founder of Maquoketa. Though now an old man, it's said, he actually went wild with boyish delight, clapping his hands and shouting for joy at the sound of the first locomotive whistle echoing through the hills. And Father Thomas Wright, too, for getting his 70 odd winners in his gratefully cut up pranks that would have befitted a 10-year-old. Well, when you do the math, Jay Goodner, as you can see, was 58 years old, but maybe back then 58 years old was 70. Yeah, right. So, anyway, you just have to remember that Jay Goodner spent much of his life here trying to get a railroad into Maquoketa. He worked very, very hard. Okay. So, the Midland Depot at this time, 1860, was on the south edge of Maquoketa, and this was by 1870, what did I say, 1870, just north of kind of where the City Limits restaurant is today, I think a little bit north of that. And the railway workers are unidentified. And then we're just going to look at a couple pictures of, oh, these are the ones that were unidentified, sorry. So, I don't know, did we call these people dandy dancers? But this is actually, we had them mislabeled for a time. This is, we thought that this was a Sebula thing, but this is actually a photograph of workers on the railroad in Maquoketa. And we didn't know their names, but Don, I believe, put them on his internet, whatever. And somebody furnished us names of 2 or 3 of them. However, we failed to get the names with the picture, and now I've got to find those names again. But the man standing in the front in the plaid shirt is somebody's great-great-uncle that we know. So I've got to get that straightened out. If anybody knows, please let us know. Okay. So this is Maquoketa. All right, the train left Maquoketa, and as the tracks went further, the first depot was in Nashville. And I remember lots of stories by Ron Yeager. He was very young, but he remembers a stockyard in Nashville. And so there was the depot in Nashville, the Baldwin Depot.
Where's Nashville located?
It's between here and Baldwin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How far would you say? 8 miles? Okay. So there's the Nashville church is still standing, right? And the Buckhorn School, that'd be part of it. It's still standing, though it doesn't, look like it did. But that was the area. So the Baldwin Depot. Am I going backwards? Yeah. When my little clicker doesn't work, I'm in trouble. Okay, so here's another picture of the Midland Depot in Baldwin, Iowa, and you see by then it was run by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. And there's the one. I'm sorry. Come to Baldwin first, and then Monmouth. Okay, so that's the depot in Monmouth. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. It was 1975, 5 years later, before the Midland got tracks as far as Monmouth. And from there it moved into Jones County, and it went as far as Anamosa, ended in Anamosa. The Midland grew fast, and by 1878 it carried 70,000 passengers in addition to lumber, cattle, and grain. It doesn't say 70,000 passengers in what time period. I went back and looked, it just doesn't say. But it had 15 stations, and they were listed on the opening slide, and over 100 employees, and it had full telegraph capacity. You can see some of the telegraph wires there. Okay, this map is kind of hard. Oops, sorry. We have another picture of the Chicago Northwestern, sorry. And this is also Monmouth, and this is the Monmouth Depot, kind of hidden behind the train. And this is a much later picture. From 1875 to 1923, that's a lot of time. Okay, and this is the map, and I know it's hard to see. In 1884, the Midland was purchased by the Chicago and Northwestern. And after that, it was known as the Midland Division. Ran through the lumber district of Lyons, connecting with several larger railroads, and that made it even more important to Jackson County because then they had a connection to get things out to where it needed to go. As I said, a lot of shenanigans occurred, and you can read about them in the books. But in 1884, it was under complete control of Chicago Northwestern. This is because they had to borrow money so many times from the Chicago Northwestern that pretty soon Chicago Northwestern pretty much just owned them, and that's the way it was. Chicago Northwestern sometimes referred to the Midland as the Anamosa branch. Okay, so one thing I have a question about, and I have been looking for an answer, and I need to know this before I go to Davenport to this railroad sign. So I'm depending on you to help me. But this says that the map shows a spur. This is what the book says. This book, written by Paul Horst, that we're going to talk about. He has this map in this book, and he says in his book that it had a spur running to Hurstville, where they backed in and loaded bricks. Well, we don't think they made bricks at Hurstville. We think that they made lime, and they shipped a lot of cattle because they had a huge, huge stockyard there. So I think that that's an error. We know, okay, so if you can see, this is where the twin lines came in from Delmer. This is where they split, and this one supposedly went west through the Maquoketa Depot into Baldwin and Monmouth. And this one went north. But he says that it went clear into Hurstville. Well, we know from paperwork that we have from Hurstville that Alfred Hurst constructed the Maquoketa, Hurstville, and Dubuque Railroad. And we know that he backed it in, he constructed the track, built bridges and everything that it needed for the track to go across. The Chicago-Milwaukee supplied the engine, the power, and the cars. They were Chicago-Milwaukee cars. So we know that he did that. We know that over a 3-year period, and we have those records, that this little 2¼ mile spur that Alfred Hurst built into Hurstville was so very profitable that after 3 years it was purchased by the Chicago-Milwaukee and St. Paul. So that's a little different than him saying that this railroad was part of the Midland. So I need somebody who has answers. So if you have answers, we need to know. Okay. Okay, so this is the Maquoketa Depot, I think, in the 20s. See that they have a motorized vehicle and whatnot. But again, it would have been, I believe, just north of city limits where the depot was. And certainly not a trace of it there. But this was a very important depot. You can see they had a large water tank. Not every depot had a water tank. And it had a large coal refueling place where they stopped in and took on more coal. Some of the trains that you would have seen at this time, again, these are newspaper pictures. They're not very wonderful, but they're better than no pictures at all, which is what we would have otherwise. This is another one. And this is there because it's the same kind of engine that was used, and the cars were very much the same. And that again is the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and it is a Baldwin engine, and it's coming from Clinton. Now, a really famous picture that probably everybody's seen, it's known as the last locomotive through Baldwin. And we use that a lot. It's a wonderful picture, and it's just kind of an icon. But the Midland became the perfect example then of what was known as a milk train, because it served rural pioneer communities from the Mississippi and inland. And without those small milk trains, as they were called, like the Midland that went to Anamosa and our Bellevue Cascade narrow gauge, those little communities and the farmers along those would have no way, because the roads were either non-existent or they were mud or snow and ice. They had no way to get things into their merchandise in. They had no way to get their goods out to market. So they were so very important. Sometime in 1944, there was a large stretch of west of Maquoketa that was almost completely wiped out by a flash flood. And at that time, the railroad was just devastated. And so it took 28 months. It was closed. At the end of that time, it resumed operation. That was November 2nd of 1946. It resumed operation again. But by then, it was having such financial problems that it was not really able to recover. And so it ended up closing in 1950. So this is the last train that went through Baldwin in 1950. We know that, and there's quite a lot of information about this, we know that this last train was a 20-car freight train, started out in Anamosa, stopped at each little depot along the way, and as it did, it picked up all the records and any kind of equipment and things that they could load on the train, and it just closed up the train as it went on to Clinton. So it was the end of an era because the Midland Railroad ran for 80 years, and it serviced over 70 miles from Clinton to Anamosa. And it was just undescribably important to the people in our area. Oops. There. Okay, so everybody probably recognizes this building. It's still there, the Midland Hotel. It was an early hotel located at 115 West Pleasant. It was built in 1871, the year after the trains came through, by William Skinner of Lyons, and it was built in honor of the Midland Railroad. It was in its prime when the Midland Railroad was operating in Maquoketa. As you can see, it was a frame structure, had 15 rooms. This must have been added on later because that looks like more than 15 rooms. But it was used as a hotel for a very long time, and then it became the Stickley Apartments, and now I believe it's owned by Lechtenberg's, and it's the Lechtenberg Apartments. But that building still stands. And then we always like to look at what else is in the picture. So as you look here, this is William Cundall's photograph studio with the slanted glass, and the Cundall building on the corner that's on Copper Cardinal today. And how fortunate we are that the man from DeWitt came from DeWitt to restore that building, because it was in very bad shape and was probably going to be torn down if he hadn't done that. So
is the Copper Cardinal the pizza place right now?
Uh-huh. Yep. So that's right here. So that building would have come down if he had not come and saved it. So when you're in there eating pizza, think of you. Okay, so a lot of the information that we have about the Midland Railroad came from this man, Paul Horst. This is the little book that he wrote, very, very interesting, very well researched, except maybe the part about Hurstville. We're gonna have to talk about that. But he did much of his research for this book. He did in our libraries. He's not the Dr. Paul Horst, the chiropractor that was in Maquoketa for many years, but they decided they were distant cousins of some sort. Because he used our information and was here so much, and we talked to him so much, I was able to talk him into doing a program for us on a Sunday in, I think, 2003 maybe. We didn't have this building, and he was at the other building on a Sunday afternoon, gave a wonderful program about his book, and just talked about the Midland, which he knows so very much about. I tried to find him. He lives in Peoria, or he did. I tried all the old contact information. I tried to find him to get him to come and do this today, but I could not find him. So anyway, we're just using his materials, and hopefully he'll forgive us. Okay, so he interviewed a lot of people in Maquoketa, a lot of people that you'll remember. Mr. and Mrs. Stanley Hale from Monmouth, Elsie Agers from Miles, Steve and Kathy Jepson from Delmer Depot with all of their information, Jim and John Eichhorn from Wyoming, and from Maquoketa he talked to Jerry Rasmussen, Irvin Pennygroth, and all of us at the library here. and as I say, came and did a program for us. He put a lot of, in the back of his book, he was very good about recording everybody who helped him do this, but somehow he forgot us. Yes?
Where does the word Midland come from?
You know, I don't know. Does anybody know? And I've never seen it written. That's just
We
what,
had been to this and that, and
Right.
where did it come from?
I don't know where it came from originally, and I read all of this stuff and I never saw that anywhere.
Then they named their school that.
Yes.
Wyoming.
Right. So I think that those later things all came from the Midland Railroad, but where it came from originally, the Midland Railroad, I've not seen. But that's another thing that we'd like to know if any of you come across that. Okay, so one of the fun things that happened doing all this was Howard and Doris Bach. And I know a lot of you knew Howard and Doris Bach. Great Historical Society members. They're both gone now, but they were both born in Baldwin, Iowa. Howard was born in 1922, and Doris was Doris Little, or Doris Littell, and she was born in 1928. They farmed in the Baldwin area, they raised a fine family, but he did they both did so much more. They taught in rural country schools, just did many things, as you will see. So this is a picture of Chattanooga School. And you see Doris Bach here, the young country school teacher. Doris, just because they're such good friends of ours, Doris graduated from Iowa State Teachers College in Cedar Falls. And I remember Doris's stories as she would come into the museum, talking about the Chattanooga School and Monmouth Township. She loved it so much. And then I remember Howard telling stories about how they moved this little one-room schoolhouse by setting it on logs, and they rolled it over 2 big hills, pulling it with teams of horses. They rolled this little school over 2 big hills out there, and it's still there today. It sits up on a bank, and it's a private house now. And when we did one of our bus tours many years ago, we went there and had a tour of that little school inside. They had made the woodshed that was attached to the school into their bedroom. And it was, the original potbelly stove was still there. It was just very, very cool. Doris ran a playtime preschool for 15 years. She loved kids and flower gardening and painting. And there's the Baldwin class of '39, and here's Howard down here. He graduated from Baldwin, attended Maquoketa Junior College, served in the Army during World War II. Then he came back to get his bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa, and he was hired as the 5th person at Clinton Engine when it opened in 1950. So Howard was so important to us getting this going because he knew so much. He shared all that information with us, and later as we began to restore things, he took upon himself the job, and we were trying to become an Iowa Great Place, which we did. He did so much to help. He became the bookkeeper because he was very meticulous with things, and he kept all the registers for us because he did not use a computer. And so I remember Mitch and I going on these long trips trying to find, into Davenport, places where they had accounting supplies and bookstores, trying to find ledgers that had enough columns in them so that he could set up the entries that he needed to keep track of our system. So he just did so much for us. Doris and Howard were members of the Historical Society, like I said, lifelong members of the Monmouth Methodist Church, and they died just weeks apart in 2011, and they're buried in Penn Cemetery. Wonderful, wonderful people that have done so much for us here. But sometime, probably in the 1940s, and I'm guessing that it was after he served in World War II and before he left for the University of Iowa, Howard worked for the Midland Railroad. He was a section hand, and one of his many passions was to write articles and letters to the editor. And he wrote 4 or 5 very special pieces about his experiences that were on this line. They were great. And they were so great that when Paul Horst wrote his book, and he spent a lot of time consulting with Howard and Doris, he put an Appendix B, in the back of the book, and he put those manuscripts, and he said that they were a credit to Howard and to his love for the Midland. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about those articles, and you should read them. I just picked out a couple highlights. In the first article to the paper, Howard wrote, "One of my most interesting jobs," and he had many through his life, "was that of a section hand on the Midland branch of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad that ran from Clinton to Anamosa. Our section went from Maquoketa to Onslow, and we operated out of Baldwin. This consisted of approximately 20 miles of track." And then he went on to explain the duties of a section hand, checking and repairing broken rails to prevent derailments and all sorts of things. And he said that his crew of 4 would travel the rails in a little 2-cycle gas car that pulled a trailer to haul it behind it if they needed to haul rails and supplies and things. I know that little wooden thing that rode the tracks is at the other museum. I know it came from Monmouth, but I don't know if that's what that was. I don't know. But he just, in his articles, he included so many interesting things that maybe we wouldn't even think about, like how did you stay warm when you were out in the frigid, freezing 20 below zero Iowa weather fixing a broken rail or something like that, and it had to be done every day. That was a lot of what was in the first article. In the second article, he talked about finding a broken rail, and the day that they found it, they were short 2 of their crew, so that there were only 2 men. 2 men could not fix it. They just didn't have the manpower to fix it. So he talked about how they marked the spot with a fusee, and that made a bright red flame, the spot where the track was broken. Then they traveled back in the direction from which the train would be coming soon, and they went back about 3/4 of a mile, and they tied what he called a torpedo on the track. Then when the engine wheel hit this, it went off like a giant cap in a cap gun, and it made a noise so loud that the engineer could hear that above the roar of the engine. And so they got that all set up. They knew when the train would be coming. They moved back from the tracks and they waited. Sure enough, the engineer came along. He heard the explosion. He stopped the train, and they were there to go out and explain to the engineer what was going on. So he said that the ride, they climbed on the train, and they inched their way down to the flare where the broken spot was. And he tells a little bit about what a remarkable ride that was. One of the best things that he'd ever experienced, he said. Happened that the engineer on that train that day was in his 60s. He had been an engineer for a long time. He was very experienced. He got out, he looked at the break in the track, and he decided that he could very slowly ease this big locomotive over the break in the tracks. Well, the fireman on the train was much younger. He was not so sure. So everybody else got off the train, and this engineer by himself took his train across this break in the tracks. And he was very successful, got the train across the tracks, stopped and picked up the firemen, and off they went. But Howard was a great writer. He tells stories. He's just so great at explaining things. You would enjoy reading his thing. The third article that Paul Horst was so excited about that he talked about, in 1847, so we know in 1847 after the war he was working for the Midland, there was still a telegraph line that ran alongside the tracks. And a supervisor came out from Clinton, and he talked to them and told them that this telegraph was supposed to operate on 12 volts. But he had to put in over 100 volts to get a message through. And the reason was that there was so much brush growing up along the lines and along the tracks. So Howard said, guess what? We spent a week doing nothing but clearing brush. So they got that problem fixed. John would have liked to have heard that story, right?
Probably.
He would have. The fourth article was just kind of fun, and I just picked things out. Howard said, one more railroad story. The Midland Railroad in Anamosa had a crossing that made Ripley's Believe It or Not. And I thought, what could that be? Well, he said it, and he could explain it like I can, but it was very long. He explained that the way that the track angled near Highway 64, going into Anamosa from the east, if you crossed it coming from the east by car, you would cross the track twice. But if you were coming the other way, the track didn't go that far, and you wouldn't cross it at all. And so the people from Ripley's Believe It or Not thought that that was very, very unusual. He also told about how they would hunt rabbits. They would carry a rifle in their little gasoline-powered car that they drove up and down the tracks, and they would shoot rabbits when they saw them. They'd stop, they'd pick up the rabbits. It was in the winter, right? They would hang them in a back room in the depot, and then when they were maybe stuck there in a blizzard or whatever, they would have a good dinner. He also said that after he quit work there to go to the University of Iowa, that there were 2 hunters that rode on each side of the train of the locomotive, and they shot pheasants as they went along. But then the bad part was that the train would stop so that they could pick up their pheasants and keep going. And Howard said that story was used as evidence when the company petitioned to go out of business because they were losing money. They were not operating very efficiently, as you can tell. So anyway, that's just some of Howard's stories. He had wonderful, wonderful stories. And just a little, since we've got just a couple minutes, in the Iowa Land Bill of 1856, Congress had made 4 land grants to the state of Iowa, United States Congress, and that was to be used, 1856, that was to be used for the building of railroads in Iowa. And then it said on the 4th of July of that year, one of those was re-granted to build a railroad from Lyons to Maquoketa, and then it was supposed to go on to the Missouri border as nearly to the 42nd parallel as possible. So that was our little Midland Railroad. Didn't quite make it that far, but this article said that by 1859, there was already 500 miles of railroad in operation in Iowa. That's 3 years after Congress granted this money. By 1868, there was 1,500 miles of railroad in Iowa. By 1867, oops, I'm going backwards there, the Chicago and Northwestern Main Line was completed from Chicago to Council Bluffs, and that the Mississippi, Maquoketa, and Western Railroad was chartered in 1868. Then in March 2nd of 1880, the Iowa Midland Railroad Company was organized at Des Moines and took possession of it. So wherever that Midland name came from, it came from Des Moines, because that's where they organized it. But whatever that was, I don't know. So anyway, that's kind of the story. There aren't a lot of pictures of the railroad, at least we don't have a lot of pictures of the railroad at that time. I bet a lot of you remember the viaduct that was out toward Baldwin on the west side of, south side of 64, right? The abutment was there for so many years. Is it still there? I don't know. Can you still see it? I haven't paid attention, but the cement abutment was there. You can see where the trains went. There's so many stories of our country school teachers that the schools were by the Midland Railroad tracks, and they told of, you know, taking their children out to watch the trains go by and that sort of thing. I'm trying to think of the name of the one where Margaret Reed taught. I can't think of the name of it. But it was right by the Midland, and she would talk about that. Okay, that's it. Does anybody have any questions, answers, suggestions? Les?
One of the early pictures you had of the train, the engine, and fuel car, and a couple of box cars, I think maybe the back by the mom, it had a tanker car.
A tanker.
And I'm wondering, what would they have there?
Right there. This
What
way?
would they have been hauling in a tank car
Oh, a tanker.
back then?
Whoa. Okay, that was 1923 by then. Oops.
Oil?
Sorry.
Would there have been enough engine-driven cars to transport gasoline, maybe?
Any idea? Kerosene? Somebody said maybe kerosene?
What did the engine run on? Coal, right?
Yeah, coal. Another thing another story that Howard told that was kind of funny was that in Maquoketa, there was, no, it would have been in Baldwin. In Baldwin, they had a place where they reloaded the coal. No, it was Maquoketa, so I don't know how to use it. They would stop there, they would take on water, and they would load the tender, I guess, with coal. But it was like there was a railroad union back then probably. The firemen did not have to shovel the coal from the back of this car that you see right here. Did not have to shovel the coal from there up to where he put it in the firebox of the engine. That had to be somebody else's job. So from time to time, when they were short, the section hands from around would get called in to come and do that. So he said he was only fortunate enough to get called in twice to do that, but everybody wanted that job because it took only 15 minutes about to do that, but you got paid for like 1.5 times for the whole afternoon. You made a lot of money for that 15 minutes. So everybody wanted to be the one to come in and shovel that coal. But you know, now that you say that, the narrow gauge ran from 1879 to 1936. They had tanker cars. This is 1923, I don't know. They didn't carry milk, did they?
It's not,
Rich?
I wondered that, it's not refrigerated, so that would.
Oh, you're right.
Could we look at the Baldwin crossing?
Whoa, yeah. So I'm going up, right?
I always thought the train was going west.
I knew somebody was going to say that. I should have known to be you. Oh, wait. Did I miss it? Where is it? The last train out of Baldwin, right? You know, I remember, and I had a note. There it is. I had a note that the last time I used this picture afterwards, somebody said to me, that train was not going east, it was going west. Is that right? You think that's going west?
The highway's right there, I think.
Okay. I should have listened to my note, right?
So the train would have to go east, wouldn't it? You're standing on the south side of the highway.
Okay.
So it wasn't the last one.
Well, I hadn't thought of that yet.
If it's going west, it wasn't the last one.
Going east.
Good point.
Well, but this train's going west
How do you know that?
by the road.
If you're standing at the south of the highway, it's going east, wouldn't it?
There's no road on the south side of the train. The road's on the north
Any
side.
ideas?
It's on the north side.
Sheila,
I'm changing the subject. just a
that's
little.
fine. I'm glad.
My grandfather was a Standard Oil delivery man,
Okay.
in Preston. And this would have been probably mostly during the 30s and 40s.
Okay.
And I think where he filled his truck up was down by the railroad tracks. And I imagine that's how the oil got delivered. But he had a soft heart for hobos. And my poor grandma never knew who was going to be at the supper table.
Oh, that's so cute. The hobo stories are wonderful. Okay.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Did it make a round trip in one day from like Clinton and Anamosa, or?
Clinton and Anamosa both had turntables, so they would take the train in and they could turn it and send it back until it went further. But that's what was interesting about Hurstville. Remember we said they had to back the train into Hurstville because there was no way to turn it around once it got there. So they had to back it in and then pull out. So
We moved to Preston in '72, and I don't know my recollection, but I can vaguely, as a possible, remember a train going through, and it was the tail end of it. When did it stop?
do you know, Don?
1980,
Oh,
May 4th, 1980 was the last train.
okay.
1980.
Wow. Okay, so you have homework, right? Homework. Help us figure out.
Bonnie.
Yeah, Don?
Oh, I had just a quick question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
So
didn't see.
That's okay. So the tracks that used to run by the Russell Brothers store then?
Yes.
How did they tie into a depot down there? I suppose with this.
Okay, so I'm so glad you said that, because my dad owned that building after it was not a Russell Brothers store anymore. And that building, if you remember, the storeroom to the back was at an angle. Was at an angle so that the train could pull right up to it. You could just open both doors and step across.
For
You
the
didn't
longest
have to.
time, I thought that was the depot.
Oh, I see, and I can see why you would. As far as I know, that was always Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul train. And that's why I'm sure that Hurstville was a spur of, it was, that Alfred Hurst built the spur and then the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul purchased it and ran it as theirs. And that same train came by the Russell Brothers store and cut right through our Clinton Engine property. And it got out by this back corner of our Clinton Engine property, and you can go out there, you can still see a gate laying on the ground because they had a gate and there was a spur that came in and ran right into this building out here that they could load onto. That was Chicago, Milwaukee, always. And so I think in this book, he's mixed them up a little bit, but he sure knows more than I do. So that's your other homework. Got to figure that personal thing out, because I tried. Okay, thank you so much for coming.